A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICAN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So we will start the day with the theme of the day. Today's prelims theme of the day will take up history, and in history we'll take up the roundtable conferences. So we know that during the course of the British colonial rule, there were 3 roundtable conferences that were held between the British government and India. The Indian National Congress and the other Indian leaders who represented India. So you will have to find out these 3 roundtable conferences, when were they held, who from the Indian side attended the conference, and from the British side, who was the Governor General of India during that time, and also what was the outcome of each of these conferences. And also these conferences, they were organized in the backdrop of some or the other events that were happening in India. So under what circumstances each of these conferences were organized is also to be found. So this again is a very important topic in history, and when it comes, usually we end up marking some wrong statement as right, because we get confused as when it happened and who all attended, what was the outcome, what was their stance. So in all these we'll get a lot of confusion, we'll have a lot of confusion. So we'll revise this topic thoroughly so that in the exam we don't have any confusion related to this. Now we will start with the first topic of the day, which is related to agriculture. So today the news was about the Agriculture Infrastructure Fund that has now been newly set up. So as the name itself suggests, the purpose of this Agri Infrastructure Fund is to fund setting up of the agriculture infrastructure. This could be the setting up of the warehouses, it could be the setting up of the cold chain infrastructure, or it could also be setting up of some processing units or the processing infrastructure. So regarding why this cold chain and why these warehouses are all important, on 18th May ICAN we have already discussed in detail the data related to the post-harvest losses, data related to the warehousing or the storage capacity in India. So you may want to go back to this slide, go back to this video and revise the same. So therefore the purpose of setting up this Agri Infrastructure Fund is to be able to set up these warehouses, cold chain, processing infrastructure, and therefore help the farmers with better value addition in agriculture, and also prevent the losses because of the delay in the marketing that is involved. So let us also try to understand the main features of this Agri Infrastructure Fund, and the reason we will be discussing the features is the features will become very important for your prelims exam. So you may have a question like regarding the Agri Infrastructure Fund, which of the following statements are correct? So you must basically understand the features of this Agri Infrastructure Fund. The first thing is it is going to provide an interest subvention. So this interest subvention of 3% will be provided for loans up to 2 crores, and this interest subvention will be provided over a period of 7 years. So an interest subvention of 3% on loans up to 2 crore will be provided for over a period of 7 years. And who are eligible to borrow from this? So this infrastructure fund, as the name itself suggests, it is a fund. So who all can borrow from this fund? So from this fund, the borrowers involve the farmer producer organizations, primary agriculture cooperative societies. So these are the eligible borrowers who can borrow from this fund. Next is a credit guarantee. Many times the banks do not want to extend credit to the farmers, and we know that a large number of the farmers still are under the clutches of the local money lenders who charge very high interest rates just because they don't have access to the institutional credit. So in order to help the banks have that confidence to be able to lend to the farmers, government under this fund is also providing credit guarantee. So that is, whatever loans are provided from this fund will also have a government backed credit coverage. So it will have a government backed credit coverage against any defaults that may happen. So now banks are fearful that if the farmers don't repay the loans, then it will lead to rise in the non-performing assets of the banks. So if these loans have the government backed credit coverage, then it will also fill the banks with more confidence when they are lending to the farmers. So these are the important features of the Agri Infrastructure Fund that has now been established. Now let us also analyze some of the issues associated with this one. The first thing is there is a lack of a convergence approach. Convergence approach means that when you have several schemes and all of these schemes are operating in parallel rather than converging those schemes in order to leverage the money available. So all of these schemes are related and they could rather be converged into a single thing so that the resources allocated to each of these schemes could be pooled together and converged together for the implementation of the common objective. But in this case, there is lack of this convergence approach. So how is that? One, there is this National Horticulture Board which is going to implement the National Horticulture Mission. So the National Horticulture Board is also at present giving credit linked subsidy on any investments that is done to build the cold chains, even the ripening chambers for the fruits. So for all of building all of these infrastructures, the National Horticulture Board is already providing subsidy on the capital investments which are made on all these infrastructure. Secondly, even under Rashtriya Krishi Vikas Yojana also, provision is there for expanding the storage capacity. So new storage capacity is created even under the Rashtriya Krishi Vikas Yojana. So in spite of these two schemes already being present, now we have a new one, that is the new Agriculture Infrastructure Fund. So rather than creating a new fund, we could have used the already existing schemes, we could have converged that so that the money that is allocated to each of these schemes could be leveraged for better meeting of the objectives. So rather than converging these two, rather than following the integration approach, we are creating yet another new fund for the same objective of creating agriculture infrastructure. So this is the first issue, that there is lack of convergence approach. The second issue is that this is not going to be a panacea. So even when all of this infrastructure is provided to the farmers, it does not by itself guarantee remunerative prices for the farmers, and it does not itself help the farmers to market their produce, because there is also a lot of information asymmetry and farmers do not have the latest information related to the markets to be able to make a decision on their cropping. So take the example of organized dairies. Even in the dairies we have these milk cooperative societies. So these societies or these organized dairies, they handle a lot of milk production every day. Even these dairies have a lot of infrastructure related to handling of the milk. For example, there are bulk coolers and several other infrastructure. But still we saw that there was a crash in the milk procurement prices. Why was there a crash in the prices in spite of all the infrastructure that was present in these dairies? So this shows that just presence of these infrastructure is itself not going to enable the farmers to market their produce so that they will get a remunerative price. So the need therefore is to help the farmers to plan their cropping. So crop planning is very important, and for the farmer to be able to take an informed decision of what he wants to plant and when, proper information dissemination to the farmers is needed. So this information dissemination to the farmers regarding what is the market demand, so that will curb this price volatility that is present, and also it will help the farmers to make better decisions regarding what they want to sow. So we have discussed what is this Agri Infrastructure Fund, what is the objective of setting it up, what are the important features which may be important from the prelims perspective, and also the issues associated with it, and what is required, what is the need in the future regarding crop planning and information dissemination. Now we'll move to the next topic, which is related to fire accidents. So this will be a part of your disaster management topic under your GS3 syllabus. So the recent news, as you all must be aware, that two COVID-19 hospitals, one in Vijayawada and the other in Ahmedabad, so they have caught fire, and it has also led to the death of several patients. Nearly 20 patients who were there in these hospitals have died so because of the fire accident, because of the fire that broke out in these hospitals due to short circuiting. So several times before also these fire accidents have happened, and they have become a commonplace. So due to the loss of life and the property that is involved in these accidents are nothing less than a disaster. So now we are going to be discussing what are all the issues associated with the handling of such fire accidents. The first thing is the regulatory loopholes. So all the buildings, whether it is a residential or the commercial buildings, they have few regulatory bylaws which they will have to comply with. But these there are, due to the presence of these regulatory loopholes, these residential or commercial buildings, they don't really adhere to these guidelines, and therefore there is no compliance with these bylaws. So this is a very important, very crucial, critical regulatory loophole that needs to be plugged. So there is lack of compliance of the regulations that are there, and there is no sanction, there is no punishment for not complying with these regulatory guidelines or procedures. The second issue is the contracting procedures. So whenever the contracting is done for building any residential complex or a commercial complex, then a lot of fire safety norms will go into the building of these buildings. So even in these contracting procedures, a lot of haste is shown. So hasty decision making is done while providing contracts, which more often than not ignores the fire safety norms which needs to be incorporated. So there are therefore loopholes in these contracting procedures also. The third issue is a failure of the civic and the fire authorities. It is the duty of the municipality, the civic authorities, to ensure that all these buildings they comply with the fire safety norms and the fire safety guidelines, and they have a no objection certificate. But however, these civic authorities have failed in these responsibilities, and so have the fire authorities. They have not been able to monitor the safety of the buildings when it comes to the with respect to safety related to the fire accidents. So this shows a failure on their part. So the next is passing the buck. Whenever a fire accident happens, the buck keeps passing from one institution to the other, from one authority to another. For example, in the case of Vijayawada and Ahmedabad, when the fire broke and it led to the death of patients, the civic authorities started blaming the hospital people, that it was a hospital management that was responsible. In fact, they did not have a no objection certificate which they should have had. So therefore, there is a failure of compliance on the part of the hospital management. The hospital management then blames the civic authorities that they have not been able to get the compliance and they have not been able to monitor the fire safety. So therefore, always there is this shifting of responsibilities on the property owners by these civic authorities, that it is they who have failed to get the no objection certificate. So this passing the buck will not lead to any solution, and it will just keep shifting the blame on the about the problem from one person to the other. The next issue is a poor upgradation. Several of the buildings are very old, and the electrical wiring in these buildings have become obsolete. They are age old and they need urgent upgradation, which has not happened for many years now. So this upgradation of the electrical wiring has not happened, and they are now very vulnerable to short circuiting, and because of the poor quality, such fire hazards have also happened. In all this context, particularly when the Upahar cinema tragedy happened in Delhi, the Supreme Court observed that time that it in fact pulled up all the authorities, and it noted that abdicating responsibility and passing the buck on the management of the institution should stop. So rather, the civic authorities or whoever is involved, whoever is concerned about it, needs to accept that responsibility, and we need to work towards it. Just shifting the responsibility and passing the buck won't help. This was noted by the Supreme Court in the Upahar cinema case. So now we will come to the steps which needs to be taken if we have to prevent and manage such fire hazards. The first is with respect to the National Building Code of India. So this National Building Code of India also has some additional fire safety procedures. So these fire safety procedures, more often than not, they are not enforced in many states, even though it is part of the National Building Code of India. So the first thing we need to do is to make these fire safety procedures, which are a part of the National Building Code of India, they must be made mandatory and they must be enforced in all the states. This is the first measure to be taken. The second is the focus must be on reducing the loss of life if and when such fire accidents happen. So for this we need to have certain equipments in the buildings, whether it is a fire extinguishers or it can even be the smoke alarms. So these alarms go on whenever a smoke is detected in the building. There should also be some sprinkler systems where water gets sprinkled over the areas where the fire has caught, and also some local firefighting aids must also be there. So the presence of all this will go to reducing the loss of life due to fire accidents. This is the second step that needs to be. The next is insurance. While we have health insurance and life insurance, a fire insurance should also gain more importance, and fire insurance coverage should gain more popularity, and that needs to be taken up by the building owners. So fire insurance is very important. The next is the evacuation system. So once the fire catches, the evacuation system needs to be up in place so that the evacuation of the people there can become possible very quickly and swiftly. So this evacuation system should become a part of the building design itself. So we need to give space in the design itself to this evacuation system, so that there are various exits and emergency windows. So this must become a part of the design of the buildings itself, so that the people can be evacuated as soon as possible in case of an emergency. So this is the next step that we need to keep in place, evacuation system as a part of the design itself. Next is the role of civil society. The civil society actually needs to build a lot of pressure on the government, on the local government, on the civic authorities, to ensure that these fire safety norms are in place and all the buildings are complying with these norms. So this pressurizing the government is one thing that this civil society will have to do. Next is regularization of the drives. So many times a lot of construction comes up on government lands, and the government will then have to go for regularization drives. So during these regularization drives, many of these constructions get regularized even though they don't meet the fire safety norms. So government should make it a point that whenever such drives happen also, even during that time, those constructions which actually comply with the fire safety norms should only be regularized and not the rest. So therefore we saw the recent example of the fire accidents that have happened in Ahmedabad and Vijayawada. Then we saw what are all the issues that usually lead to these fire accidents. We saw the Supreme Court's observation in the Upahar Cinema case, which you must quote in your answers. Then we saw several steps which need to be taken to be able to prevent and also to handle and manage whenever such fire accidents take place. Now we'll go on to the topic which is related to the taxation policy. This is a part of your GS3 syllabus on taxation, economic policies and all that. So basically this article says that when it comes to the taxation policy of India, we know that India follows a progressive system of taxation, but however there are two problems in the Indian taxation system. First is that India's taxation system has become pro-rich and anti-poor. And secondly, Indian taxation system has been such that it has not been able to mobilize enough fiscal resources for the government. So on the one hand, it is pro-poor and pro-rich and anti-poor. And second is, it has not also been able to mobilize enough fiscal resources for the government. So now we will analyze problems. So first, the article claims that the taxation policy is pro-rich. So let us see those steps by the government which shows that the taxation policy is pro-rich. So earlier there was a 2% surcharge that was levied on the super rich. Super rich means whose income was more than 10 crore per annum. So a surcharge of 2% was levied on the super rich, but this was also rolled back later. So therefore this was like helping the rich by reducing the taxation burden on them. The second was the corporate tax was also slashed. So earlier it was 32%, then it further reduced and now it has been reduced to 22%. So the corporate tax has also been now slashed. The main purpose of doing this was to attract the Indian companies to invest in India, even the foreign companies to come and invest in India. So the main purpose of slashing the corporate tax was this, but however this definitely will go on to further help the pro-rich and reduce their tax burden. So what happens when the tax burden on the rich gets reduced? then the government will see a revenue loss. For example, by slashing of the corporate tax, the government lost a revenue of 1.5 lakh crore. So when the government loses revenue, the government will have less money with it. That is, we can say that the state itself has become poorer by 1.5 lakh crore now. So poor state, therefore the government has less resources with itself and its expenditure is definitely high. Therefore the fiscal deficit will become high. So for instance, for the fiscal 2019-20, the fiscal deficit has been 4.5%. So the fiscal deficit of the government will increase because its incoming revenue has been slashed because these corporate tax was slashed. So increase in the fiscal deficit will automatically have a bearing on the welfare spending of the government. So the welfare spending of the government will also reduce automatically. That is, the public spending on important social sectors like health and education has also been stagnated because of the less revenue available with the government. So therefore these are all those arguments which shows that the taxation policy of the government is pro-rich, and also that the government has not been able to mobilize enough resources, and because of the revenue loss, how it is ultimately affecting the welfare spending by the government. The next argument is that the taxation policy in India is also anti-poor. Now we will see several examples which support this claim. So the first is the cesses and surcharges. Cesses and surcharges are a way of indirect tax which is going to affect anybody irrespective of the person being rich or poor. So there has been an increase in the number of surcharges and cesses. For example, there is a Swachh Bharat cess, there is a Krishi Kalyan cess. So like that, there has been increase in the levy of cess by the central government. And also, even when a lot of new cess are announced and the money is collected, there is no transparency with respect to the amount of money that is collected as a part of cess, and also on what purpose it was utilized. So this accounting itself is also not transparent when it comes to cess. The second is the share of indirect taxes has increased in the government's overall revenue. So you must know that the government's revenue, that is a taxation revenue, comes from two sources: the direct taxes, which comprises of the income tax and the corporate tax, and the indirect taxes, which comprise of the central excise, customs and other things. So therefore the direct tax is one, the indirect tax is one where everybody will have to pay it irrespective of the rich or the poor. But direct tax is more progressive because the one who earns more is the one who pays the tax more. But in the case of indirect taxes, everybody will have to bear the burden. So therefore the indirect taxes are actually in a way not progressive, and they affect the poor people. So if we say that the share of indirect taxes has increased in the overall gross revenue of the government, so this is a regressive thing and is an anti-poor measure. So if you look at the indirect tax share that is increased, the share of the indirect taxes in the overall gross revenue of the government was nearly 43% in the financial year 2011. So now it has become nearly 50% in the financial year 2019. So you can see how the share of indirect taxes has increased. Next is the increase in the customs and the excise also. So this increase in the customs and the excise duty has been on some commonly used goods, like be it sugar or petroleum goods, petroleum products. So there has also been increase in customs and excise duty, which again will have to be borne by the poor as well, as much as the rich bears it. Next is the service tax increase. The service tax also has increased. In the year 2014, the service tax was nearly 12%, but now under the GST regime, the service tax is increased to 18%. So this again is a tax which both the poor and the rich will have to bear equally. Next is the dependency on the indirect tax. So as I say that the share of indirect tax has increased, which means even the dependency of the government on the indirect tax revenue has also gone up. So recently you can see how during the COVID-19 cases, the pandemic, how the states were compelled to open their liquor outlets so that they could collect some liquor revenue, which is an indirect tax for the states. So they have been so much dependent on this indirect tax, that is liquor revenue, that they had to open these liquor outlets even during the pandemic, even though the social distancing norms and all could not be observed in the liquor outlets. So this shows how the states have been increasingly becoming dependent on the indirect tax. Also, even the center has increased the duty on fuel, particularly petrol, by rupees 10 per litre. This is a huge hike seen in the context of the global oil price meltdown. So this again is a huge hike, and this is also an indirect tax. So this why the government has done like this, even when the oil prices and the global level are reducing. This is because government is again increasingly dependent on the duty on fuel, which is an indirect tax. So all of these points to the fact that our taxation policy has been anti-poor. So whenever you have any question on critically analyzing India's taxation policy, so one is that it is definitely progressive and you will write your set of arguments for that. But in the case of critical analysis, you can use these arguments that it is pro-rich and it's anti-poor and is also unable to mobilize enough resources for the government, which has ultimately affected the welfare spending of the government. Now we'll move, which is related to suicide, that is a mental health issue. This is a part of your GS2 syllabus on mental health, which is a part of your health related issues. So recently, after the alleged suicide by Sushant Singh Rajput, this debate has again come into the forefront that suicide is a severe mental health issue which needs to be emphasized upon, and we need to learn to handle the depression and other mental health disorders, and we need to pay utmost attention to them. In this context, sociologist Emily Durkheim he spoke about anomie. Anomie means that it's a feeling of alienation and isolation that is felt by individuals. So when an individual feels very alienated and isolated, that is when the propensity to commit suicide will increase. So this is what sociologist Emily Durkheim said, that there is this anomie, that is a feeling of alienation and isolation among individuals, which increases the propensity by them to commit suicide. So now we'll see some 4 important reasons which were mentioned in the editorial as to why these issues lead to finally the person committing suicide. First is the strained social relationships. So when we talk of strained social relationships, it can be the conflicts between the individuals, or it can be the misunderstanding that happens between them, or it can also be the discrimination that one faces at the hands of the other. So these are some 3 main manifestations of the strained social relationships. Because of this, the person is compelled to commit suicide. The second reason is a feeling of loneliness. So this has become a very common thing that several people have started to feel very lonely, but however they don't come out and seek help for that. Why? Because loneliness is always connected to the personal failure. So why is it that? Because if I feel lonely, that is because I have personally failed. I am a personal failure, and that is why nobody is with me, and so I feel lonely. So this is a perception. So whenever somebody wants to come out in the open and say that I feel lonely, they fear that they will be judged by the other people that this person is lonely because he must have been a personal failure. So this is stopping people from even coming out in the open and speaking out that they are lonely and they need some company. This loneliness is thus another reason for committing the suicide. The third is the feeling of fear. So fear as an emotion could be on anything, whether it could be fear of death, or whether it could be the fear of economic constraints that the person faces, the fear that I might end up being very lonely. So the fear of being lonely, or the fear of being dependent on others. So the fear of many things. So these fear, for instance, during the corona crisis also, many people could not bear that fear and anxiety of the fact that they might die or they might lose their near and dear ones. So they have committed suicide. This fear and unnecessary anxiety is again leading to suicide. The last reason is rejection. So when a person gets rejected by someone, then for the person, he feels that there is no emotional intimacy. So people crave for emotional intimacy, and when somebody faces rejection, they will feel that there is no emotional intimacy. and also they do not have any social partners to make them feel that they are a part of this company. Because of this rejection, it is very natural that the person feels very frustrated. And also, why is it that I am being rejected? Maybe because I am worthless. This is a feeling among individuals. So they start feeling worthless when somebody rejects. So these are the 4 ways through which rejection contributes to this tendency of suicide among the people. So this whole article explained these are the main reasons why, the emotional reasons why somebody may attempt a suicide. Now we'll move to topic, which is the World Health Organization. This is a part of your GS2 syllabus which talks about international organizations and their functioning. So we have seen even in the past, we have analyzed the functioning of WHO when United States was threatening to stop its funding to WHO. So we had seen how WHO was being criticized for its lukewarm response to this corona pandemic. So even when the first case of corona happened way back in November in China, but it was only on January 30th that WHO declared coronavirus, the COVID-19, to be a public health emergency. So there were several times when WHO has downplayed the severity of this crisis, and it was even earlier criticized for poor handling of the Ebola outbreak that happened in 2014. So now let us see the 4 important issues that were mentioned in this article regarding the functioning of WHO. There are 4 major issues with WHO. First is the organizational lethargy. So this shows how the organization has been very poor in its response. So it is not very swift in its responses. The example that you can give is of the coronavirus, where the first case was detected and when it was declared as a public health emergency, and how it downplayed the severity of crisis. So this is an example of the organizational lethargy where WHO has been very slow in its responses. The second is the absence of a decisive leadership. So leadership is very important, and this has not been always there with WHO, that there is a weak leadership also. So one example for this is during 1998 to 2003, the SARS epidemic was that time in news. So the former Director General of WHO during this period of 1998 to 2003, during that time, WHO was projected and as one single entity. WHO spearheaded the global response against the SARS virus. There was timely containment of the SARS pandemic. All of this was possible because of the decisive leadership of the then Director General of WHO. So you can contrast that with the current leadership, which has showed a very delayed response to the pandemic. So this is an example regarding the decisive leadership which has to be present. The third is a bureaucratic indolence, and fourth is underfunded programs. So whenever any question comes on the WHO and asking for its critical analysis, among the major issues you can cite these 4 issues. So the example, as I have already discussed, is the handling of the SARS pandemic. Now we will see the funding issues. So the WHO receives funding from 3 major sources. One is the contribution that it gets from the member states itself. The second is the voluntary contributions that it gets from various donors. And the third is the private donors who will contribute. So, however, the contribution that is made by the member states, this contribution is usually used by the WHO according to its own priorities. That is, according to the priorities which are actually the need of the hour. So, but however, these contribution by the member states contribute to just 17% of the overall funding that the WHO receives. But when we come to the voluntary contributions, these contributions have also been very irregular. So you don't know how much who will contribute. So this has been irregular. And also these voluntary contributions are done by these donor institutions, and these donors have their own priorities. So because they are voluntarily contributing money to WHO, the WHO will have to allocate these money in consultation with the donors, but not according to the priorities which would have been the need of the hour at that time. So 80% of the money or the resource revenue that WHO receives is through the voluntary contribution. So therefore you can say that for 80% of the money which has to be allocated, WHO has to consult these voluntary donors and then only then decide where this money will have to be put to use. So in a way we can say that there is a donor driven agenda when it comes to allocating the resources of WHO for fighting various health issues globally. So this basically dilutes the autonomy of decision making by WHO. So the autonomy of decision making is also diluted because of this donor driven agenda. So these are the funding issues when it comes to the functioning of WHO. So then these are the other articles which were not really important. This was on EIA notification draft, on which we have already discussed in detail. Then this was again on secularism, which nothing was concrete. 370 we have discussed it several times. This was on COVID testing, not very important. Trump or Biden is again a political kind of an article, though it was by C. Rajamohan, but it was not much important. China article is again a repetition. And this article, the main bricks to use in India's steel frame. Though the topic is important, but the content of the article was there was nothing concrete in it. Then again, shortfalls in the GST collection and the delay in the compensation received by the states. We have again seen it multiple times, and there was no new material in this article. So now we'll have a look at the prelims question of the day related to current affairs. So the country's first ever E-Lok Adalat was recently organized in which state? So you'll have to tell the answer to this, and yesterday's answer, it was UNODC, as many of you have rightly pointed out in the comment section. So keep writing in the comment section, keep reviewing each other and encourage and motivate each other. That's it for today. Thank you.